if any even word, even sort of hint of what the king thought about this were to come out in the open, it would be what they call legal jeopardy.
Robert, lovely to see you. And actually, it isn't that long since we spoke to you about the first edition of this book, which came out in the January of 2024.
This year, yeah.
And then what happened almost immediately afterwards?
I think almost the day after the book came out, or certainly in the same week, we had the words "enlarged prostate" in a palace medical bulletin, which were quite striking, which of course was on the same day that it was announced that the Princess of Wales was in hospital for abdominal surgery and would be off duty until Easter. So it was quite a serious day, which then became all the more serious the following month when it transpired that the king was undergoing treatment for cancer. And then about a month and a half after that, we had that remarkable video of the princess on the bench amid the daffodils saying that she too had cancer, and suddenly the monarchy was in this probably its greatest challenge since the 1990s, and really since then things have sort of been going in a slow but upwards direction, and all sorts of extraordinary things along the way. So I wanted to capture all that, which is why this edition of the book is somewhat fatter than the last one.
I was surprised. This new book does say that the king had a cancer scare earlier in his life. I didn't know that.
No, we didn't know that.
We were not told.
We were not told that. We don't know the nature of it. We don't know very little more than that. But the fact was there was an earlier scare. And I think we have to remember that, here is someone who has been very close to the whole sort of world of cancer, if you like, who's sort of patron of a number of charities like Marie Curie, which he takes a keen interest in every year, for example, before Christmas, without any cameras off the sort of, the regular royal duties. He goes around hospices before Christmas. I mean, he has a very good working knowledge of the latest cancer care treatments, the effects. So he's as patients go, I would say he has a pretty well developed sense of the disease.
And there was a certain amount of transparency about his condition because he is the head of state. But we still don't know what kind of cancer he's got.
No, that's the one thing that they're holding back, and I think, well, from my understanding, is they will continue to hold back on is what sort of cancer was it, just because I think there's a sort of sense that, there should be something that remains private between, a patient and doctor. I think there was a worry that if they were specific about what sort of cancer it was, immediately everyone would go charging off down that particular rabbit hole and picking out, all the different treatments on that, but excluding the rest, if you like, of the sort of cancer spectrum. I think there was a sort of sense of wanting to show solidarity with everybody dealing with the disease. And so that element of it hasn't been made available, but he was very keen early on. There is a sort of sense, look, I am the head of state, therefore you do have a right to know how I am, how I'm doing. And so even from the start, when he was when he was essentially in seclusion, he was locked away at Sandringham, but he would come down to London to go and see the doctors. But he made a point of always going in the state Bentley, which is a very sort of visible car with big sort of wide windows, and not having lots of outriders and whizzing around, going slowly, at the normal speed, waving at people. There was a sort of sense of, look, it's all right. And as soon as he could start shaking hands again, which was at Easter, then, the doctors had to give it the say-so, but then, then he started sort of re-engaging, if you like, with the public. And so in that period, it was a sort of reminder, really. It was a bit like back to the days of COVID, where he was sort of operating constitutionally. He was doing all the constitutional stuff, still seeing the Prime Minister, seeing all the papers, the red boxes would come and go, the greeting ambassadors, all that kind of stuff would happen. But it was being done at sort of arm's length, if you like. I mean, he couldn't do it. He couldn't meet the public. But then, as we got into the summer, as we got to things like the 80th anniversary of D-Day, there he was on the beaches of Normandy. And really by the end of the summer, he was there was a state banquet for the Emperor of Japan. And you actually then had to sort of start reminding people, this man is still undergoing treatment for cancer. And I think you still do. I mean, he pressed the pause button when he went off to Australia and then to Samoa for the Commonwealth Summit the other day, but the treatment continues.
Obviously, he will have received the very best possible care and advice, but were you surprised that he undertook that tour?
Not knowing how seriously he takes the Commonwealth, I think, had he not been resuming kind of duties in late summer, had he still been in, as it were, in sort of seclusion, then I would have been. But the fact that he was doing things like his birthday parade, doing walkabouts, doing garden parties. I mean, he did several garden parties this summer. And everything's been sort of slightly altered. The garden party wouldn't be quite as long, or the state banquet wouldn't last quite as long. But the tour to Australia. Normally, any tour to Australia by a monarch would include New Zealand, but the doctor said, look, you can do one country, but you can't do two. So there've been little sort of concessions along the way, but throughout there's been a sense of trying to stick to business as usual with a few tweaks, but not pretending that there's been any great, that no one talks about cures or recoveries or anything like that. That he's still undergoing treatment.
And he's always had an interest in alternative medicine, homeopathy. Who is he consulting? Do we know?
Yeah, there's a new head of the Royal Medical Household, which is a sort of the top doctor, who's a chap called Mike Dixon, who does have an interest in homeopathy, and has been criticised for that, but who's first and foremost a regular doctor, bringing in all the top specialists, but who has a sort of open mind on this. So we don't know precisely what sort of medication he's getting, because we don't know precisely what sort of cancer he's got. But I'm left in no doubt that it's all the regular, modern, conventional, latest, up to date medication and treatment. But if there is a bit of homeopathy in the mix, well, that's up to him.
And what about spiritual guidance?
Yes, he's. I think we've known he's always interested in other faiths, but I think we've often sort of overlooked his own faith, and it runs deep. All those years when we might see the Queen going to church every Sunday, we wouldn't see him going to church on a Sunday, but he always did. He always has done, and he's got this tiny little chapel that he's had built in the garden at Highgrove, which he calls the Sanctuary. It's only got room for about 3 people in it, but during his sort of the dark days of this year, he would have Sunday services in there, and I talked to his very old friend Richard Charters, the former Bishop of London, Lord Charters, who went down to conduct communion there and had long chats with them about it. And what's really interesting is he's very stoical about it. He's sort of very conscious of the sort of fragility, if you like, of the kind of human condition. But he's stoical, and one thing that was there in the sanctuary was a well-thumbed copy of the works of St. Silouan, who I have to admit I didn't know very much about, who was a Russian Orthodox monk, who has a fairly sort of grounded philosophy, which is not one of sort of fluffy, nice miracles will happen. I think his sort of watchword is keep your mind in hell and do not despair. It's a sort of it's a bit
brisk.
Well, he's been reading St. Silouan. That's
How are we spelling this saint? I'm going to
look him up. Silouan. He's Russian Orthodox monk.
Right, gosh, keep your mind in hell and
do not despair. Yeah. I think that's it. You check it out.
Yeah, pop that on a T-shirt, everybody. Can we talk a bit about how the illness has affected his relationships within the family? For the people who would love to see a very happy ending for the Windsors, there was this huge hope, wasn't there, that Prince Harry and his father would have a really proper reconciliation. And actually that did seem to be forthcoming from Prince Harry's side when the news first arrived of his father's illness. But where do you think we find them now?
Well, I think everyone was rather touched that, Harry's instant reaction on hearing the news was to hop on a plane and fly from California to London to see his father, and just to sort of say, look, you're my father, I love you, I'm with you, I'm rooting for you. And then he went home again, and since then, there hasn't been much communication, but that, as I discovered while working on this new edition, was for sort of 3 reasons principally. I mean, one is Harry's got a lot of, as we know, he's got a lot of issues he wants to unpack, he wants to deal with, to do with his treatment by the palace, by the monarchy, and whatever. And everyone's trying to keep the sort of pressure levels down, the stress levels of the king down. And now is not the time to have a sort of heated family summit on that. The second point is that any sort of rapprochement with Prince Harry has really got to be done in tandem with the Prince of Wales. The king can't sort of have any sort of, if you like, bilateral deals with Harry, but leaving William out of the conversation because, you know, one day he'll be king, and the king's obviously got to be very mindful of his relations with his heir, who's very much part of the sort of working royal unit. And then the third factor, which I discovered, and this is the one that's particularly makes things particularly difficult. People saying, why can't the king and Harry, why can't they just sit down and talk? It's because Harry is suing the government at the moment. And as one constitutional expert put it to me, if you imagine the situation where you've got the king's son suing the king's ministers in the king's court, if any even word, even sort of hint of what the king thought about this were to come out in the open, it would be what they call legal jeopardy. It would basically pull the rug out from under the case, as happened with the Paul Burrell case way back in 2002, the former royal butler who was was in the dock on various charges, and then it transpired that the late Queen had remembered a conversation with him, and the whole case fell apart. So there's this sort of the Paul Burrell precedent, if you like, is part of this as well. So for now, there isn't going to be any great reunion of any sort, but I think he does have an open mind. I mean, you know, doors have been left open. I think in due course we probably will see a warming. We will see a situation where perhaps, you know, Harry does come back and maybe goes up and spends a few days in Balmoral with his father. You know, that I think those days will come. I just think not yet.
Well, I think we could have done with some of Harry and Meghan's stardust this year, not least because the Princess of Wales has been very ill as well. And we never did know entirely. Well, we don't know what is wrong with her either. And I'm not saying we should know, by the way. I think she is entitled to her privacy because she doesn't have a constitutional role.
That's it, yeah.
She has very young
there's
children.
an understanding that she is in a different category.
Yeah.
He's head of state. We have a right to know. She's not head of state. Therefore, our right to know is rather reduced.
But do you know how she is doing?
Yeah, all I know is I think what most people know, which is that, again, the direction of travel is sort of positive. If you look back to where we were at the start of the year to where we are now, I mean, up until this month, she'd only made 3 public appearances because it's a different situation when you're a young mother of 3 and you're trying to deal with this, and you're probably the most scrutinised woman in the world. I mean, I think everybody understands why she would rather undergo her recovery privately. But as I say, up until this month, there'd only been 3 public appearances, literally, in 2024. And then suddenly we had 2 back-to-back over Remembrance Weekend. She was at the Albert Hall, and then the next day she was at the Cenotaph. And I think we'll see her as we get into Christmas and sort of those Christmas events like her carol concert at Westminster Abbey, and particularly Christmas Day. I think we'll see her back in a more traditional role. I'm not sure it'll be a complete kind of resetting of the dial, but definitely she's moving towards doing more work, getting reconnected with her charities. So as I say, it's going in the right direction. But as she said, I mean, there was that extraordinary video she did back in September, and I think people were very struck by the sort of those scenes of the prince and princess and their children on a sort of in the woods and on the beaches of Norfolk, and it was all very kind of wholesome and nice and upbeat. But I thought her words were very important too, and they were rather more somber. They were very realistic. They were sort of, look, you know, it's been brutal at times, this thing, and we're taking one day at a time, but I'm doing my best. I'm working towards getting better. And
you do suggest in this new revised edition of your book that she may have an increased interest in spiritual matters.
Yeah, well, in the previous edition, in this edition as well. I mean, it's pretty clear that the Prince of Wales, Prince William, does not share his father's, or his grandmother's deep-rooted faith, shall we say. He's not particularly keen on going to church. I mean, he understands the obligations that a monarch has towards being Supreme Governor of the Church of England and all that, but he's not naturally interested in faith. But when I then started asking about her, and without, I mean, no one was going to sort of open up on her sort of inner theological thoughts, but it was very clear that everyone feels I think the Frasers are more hopeful in that direction. She's definitely showing a greater degree of interest in all things spiritual.
Okay, I mean, it's not been an easy time for the church. The Archbishop of Canterbury has just resigned. Lots of people think it's time to do something about the Church of England's role in our national life. Prince William's lack of interest in the Church of England, at the moment, he will still be the head of it. It makes no sense.
He'll be the supreme governor. I always remember when I started out as a journalist at the Daily Telegraph, getting rapped over the knuckles for saying that the Queen was head of the Church of England. I was always told, no, the Queen is the supreme governor of the Church of England. The head of the Church of England is God.
Of course.
It's a kind of constitutional role. It's laid down by Acts of Parliament. So if anyone wants to change that, over to you, Keir Starmer. I don't think that's going to change. I mean, ultimately, the role is about protecting faith, protecting the Church of England. How you yourself interact with faith, well, that's a more personal thing. But as long as he is fulfilling the sort of the official part of the role, which is to protect the Anglican faith and by implication all the other faiths in this country, and it is an unusual position where you have a head of state who does have a formal religious role. It doesn't really happen in many other democracies in Europe. Then he will do that.
The royal family's had a really tough year, and I think everybody would agree that we wouldn't wish this on anybody, what they've been through. But money is rather tawdry, but we have to talk about it. And the fact that Prince Andrew, who has been resident now in this substantial home in Windsor Great Park, Royal Lodge, there appears to be no moving him. The King has tried. And he's now found us a new source of revenue. Where? How?
Where? How? I mean, we'd love to know. It has to be legitimate. I mean, it will have been checked out.
Will it? Who by?
Well, by the not least the keeper of the Privy Purse, and the sort of the financial powers that be at the palace. I mean, what the situation was that the Prince Andrew was receiving. Prior to his disastrous interview with Newsnight and his sort of fall from public life, the Queen was meeting the cost of the late Queen was meeting the cost of his security at Royal Lodge, because it's an expensive place. It's outside the official cordon, so it needs its own security, and it needs a certain amount of maintenance done on it. And Prince Andrew, leads a sort of a royal, albeit now much reduced, but still a sort of royal life. So, these tabs were being met. And then since he's retreated from public life, there's no longer the argument that the public, if you like, or the monarchy has any obligation to continue paying that security bill. And so he was told, look, if you move into, there's a perfectly respectable empty house within the cordon, Frogmore Cottage, move in there, you can carry on. And he said no. And eventually things came to a head in late summer. And the King said, well, I'm not going to carry on paying your living allowance if you insist on living in this house. And he went, well, I'm going to carry on living here. So he called the King's bluff, and the living allowance has been turned off. So he's now liable for his living costs or living allowance and the maintenance and the security. That's a lot. He's got to find that money. He says he's got the wherewithal. He will clearly have some funds in a savings account somewhere. Those are what are paying the bills for the moment. He claims claims there are sources he has of income that will continue to do this.
What are they, Robert? What does he do?
Well, I mean, like anyone, like any individual. I mean, he's entitled to certain sort of privacy over his sort of, what's in his bank account and what he does with it. I mean, like the rest of us. But that has to be that has to come from legitimate sources. Not least because Royal Lodge, aside from being a very kind of prominent home of a monarch, I mean, it's where George VI lived. It's the Queen Mother famously lived there for most of her life. It actually belongs to the Crown Estate. Crown Estate answers to the Treasury. Treasury answers to the government. So that there have to be it has to be above board. But how long the savings will go to paying the millions, frankly, which is what it costs each year. To protect it, to keep him going. We don't know, but as and when he possibly needs to come back and ask the King for a handout, he might find that things are a little less sympathetic.
Do you think that we will ever see the current Prince of Wales paying some kind of inheritance tax?
Well, that is, again, these are things that are ultimately, they're down to the government. I mean, all this stuff is, there's a sort of, obviously it's been in the news a lot lately with the Dispatches, Sunday Times, investigation into what the two duchies, the Duchy of Lancaster, which provides sort of money for the privy purse for the monarch, Duchy of Cornwall provides the money for the heir to the throne. They're separate, they're historic, they go back to medieval times. Debate on how they get their money, how they're taxed. All that is laid out every year. It's there on the internet. It's some sort of furtive, opaque, kind of cozy deal that's highly suspect. It's laid out in something called I think it's the Memory of Understanding on Royal Taxation. It's a Treasury document. It's about 22 pages long. It explains
So we can
the
all
deal.
see it.
You can all see it.
Okay.
And any changes to it are a matter for, again, they're a matter for the government. I mean, there was actually a cabinet minister. I noticed he was on the radio the other day. Nobody asked him about it. There was a chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, McFadden.
Pat McFadden.
Yeah. Who he signs off on these accounts. And he was on the airways the other day talking about, government policy. I was waiting for someone to say, well, you are the chancellor of the Duchy. You sign these accounts. Nobody asked him. Because I think the chancellor, I mean, normally that role, it's shorthand for a sort of, cabinet fixer, but it always goes to a senior member of the government. All these things are that it's not as simple as just.
I get that, but what I think would stick in the throat was the things that sprang out at me were the fact that the NHS and the armed forces pay rent to the royal family. That does seem quite, particularly weirdly, the armed forces just seems extraordinary. They pay to be able to train on Dartmoor. Yeah,
well, I mean, the landed estates, going back since time immemorial, I mean, the clue's in the title, they're landed, they have land, and land is rented out. I mean, it just is. And the same goes for other landed estates, same goes for institutions like the Church of England, like most Oxbridge colleges, like most pension funds. They own property. Those properties are rented out to people. There is a market. People want to rent them. I mean, as it happens, some of those tenants, some of those deals that the two duchies do are actually, I mean, there was a big row. What on earth is I think it's the Duchy of Cornwall is charging the RNLI rent on beaches. How on earth can this happen? How can the lifeboats be paying rent? Then you actually dig down and you find that these are peppercorn rents. It's about £100 a year to park a lighthouse on a lifeboat station on a beach. It's to protect the leasehold rights of those organisations. It's not a money making venture. It's part of the sort of legality and the complex nature of property, and actually that is that's how it goes. I mean, you won't get a complaint from the RNLI on that. But yeah, with some of them, I mean, it doesn't look good. Everybody's got to accept that. You're renting out a parcel of land in London to the NHS. It's for millions. But I mean, there are other people queuing up to rent it out. The NHS asked if they could rent it. That's what happens. That's the deal that happens, as I said, with our pension funds, with the C of E, with any other number of property holders. You could argue that yes, that land, if they shouldn't be paying, they shouldn't be charging rent to the armed forces or the NHS or other government bodies. Well, that's fine, but then after a while, all that would happen was that the duchies would be renting everything to charities in the armed forces. At which point, you might as well nationalise them because suddenly they're not delivering any returns, so they cease to be the entities they were set up to be.
Do you think you will be the person who writes the late Queen's official biography?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, I have written 3 books about her. I did write her biography in 22, and it was, I mean, look, I enjoyed doing it. It was a great life, and it was the Sunday Times very kindly made it Biography of the Year in 2022. I suspect the view will be it's somebody else's turn.
But if the person who does get that role will get their mitts on her diaries.
They will. And as I discovered while doing this new edition, I had a glimpse, well, not a glimpse, I had an inkling. I didn't actually see them, but I discovered what her last diary entry was, actually. It was in the week of her death, and it was it began with Edward came to see me. That's her private secretary, Sir Edward Young, and it concerned her the arrangements for the Privy Council meeting that was upcoming to deal with the new Truss administration. So she was writing a diary right till the end, and occasionally we had the odd the odd sort of hint of how she wrote it. The diarist Kenneth Rose once talked to her about it, and she said she wrote half a page every day, but not conversations. So whoever does get this will suddenly get 70 years of these handwritten diaries. And of course, a lot of them will be quite, workmanlike, had lunch with the Prime Minister, whatever it is. But in there, because she gave me access to her own father's diaries, which are unpublished, his war diaries, when I was writing her biography. And there's a lot of, fairly basic and ordinary day-to-day stuff. But in there, it was always in there, there are these little glimpses at moments of tension, crisis, these fascinating throwaway lines, like when he was nearly killed 3 times in a week in September 1940. And, he sort of admits to being in shock, and he's really worried he's going to develop a bunker mentality, and he can't read, he can't concentrate. And this is fascinating. So I think there will be those sort of moments in there, and they will be remarkable, because she was this wonderfully kind of private person, despite being the most famous woman in the world. We all long to know what she thought about things, and we never really did in many ways, and we will do one day.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.